Hi, thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. In this video, we're going to read Job 35 and talk about God's needs. More specifically, does God need anything? The events recorded in the book of Job probably took place around 2000 BC. What we're going to see in Job 35 is Elihu essentially told Job that Job was utterly insignificant compared to God, and Job can't do anything that can possibly help God nor hinder God. And the question is, was Elihu correct? Well, we're going to look at a passage in Psalm 50 where God essentially says he doesn't get hungry, so he doesn't really need sacrifices. We're going to look at a passage in Isaiah 66 where God essentially says he doesn't need a house, and so he doesn't really need a temple or tabernacle or anything like that. And we're going to look at Acts 17 where Paul essentially said God doesn't need anything. And so we see that Elihu was correct. Now, this is important for us living in the 21st century because sometimes we get in the mindset that we think that we need to use our gifts and abilities to serve God, even if that means disobeying some of God's commandments. But what we're going to see is that God really wants that more important than using our gifts or abilities is that God wants us to obey Him. Now, having said all that, let's take a look at the passage in Job. The passage we're going to look at today is represented by this little box here. At the very beginning of the story, just to refresh your memory, the Bible tells us Job was very upright, he was very wealthy, and then Satan came along and Satan destroyed all of Job's possessions. He killed Job's children, and he afflicted Job with boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. And then three friends named Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar heard about all this calamity that happened to Job, and they went to Job and they tried to comfort him and encourage him. And there was a long dialogue between these men. These three friends tried to convince Job he was suffering because he had sinned. Job insisted he was innocent. Now, these four men did not know that Satan was the real reason that Job had lost everything. Now, there was also a man named Elihu who listened to this long dialogue, and after these men stopped speaking, Elihu started to speak, and Elihu also tried to convince Job that he was suffering because he had sinned. Now, as I said, we're going to look at Job 35 today. It's represented by this box here, and Elihu continues trying to convince Job that he was suffering because he had sinned. So let's get started. Job 35, verse 1. Then Elihu continued and said, "Do you think this is according to justice? Do you say, my righteousness is more than God's?" Now notice a single quote. This is a quote that Job had said earlier. And apparently at some point, Job claimed that he was more righteous than God, which obviously is a very brazen thing to say. Now here, Elihu essentially went to Job and said, "Do you think that this," now the pronoun "this" refers to Job's self-assessment. In other words, during that long dialogue between Job and his friends, Job kept claiming that he was innocent, and that he was upright, and that he had not done anything to deserve the calamity that he was suffering. Here, Elihu essentially asked Job, do you think that you're being just when you make this self-assessment? And especially when you say that you're more righteous than God. Now, obviously, this is a rhetorical question, and so Elihu's implied answer was no, Job was not being just and right when he assessed himself this way. Elihu continued in verse 3. The pronoun you refers to Job. For you say, quote, "What advantage will it be to you," referring to God, "what profit will I have more than if I had sinned?" Now, the pronoun it refers to Job's suffering. So Job and this is, Elihu was quoting Job here. Notice the quotes. Job said, "What advantage will my suffering be to God?" is essentially what Job asked. And then Job asked, "What profit will I have more than if I had sinned?" So in other words, Job believed he was innocent, and yet he was suffering this terrible calamity. And so Job wanted to know how this suffering benefited God. And Job also wanted to know what was the benefit to Job of following God if he was going to suffer this great calamity and suffer as if he was a great sinner? Now, Elihu started answering this in verse 4. I will answer you and your friends with you. Look at the heavens and see, and behold the clouds. They are higher than you. Now here, Elihu essentially said to Job, look up, look at the clouds, and realize how high they are. Remember, this is way back before air travel, and so humans had no concept of being able to fly and fly up into the clouds. And so when they were on the ground and looked up to the clouds were very high, and they had no chance of ever reaching those clouds. Elihu was simply trying to point out to Job how tiny and insignificant he was compared to God. Elihu continued in verse 6. If you have sinned, what do you accomplish against God? Now this is a rhetorical question. The answer was nothing. And if your transgressions are many, what do you do to God? Again, the answer was nothing. If you are righteous, what do you give to God? The answer was nothing. Or what does God receive from your hand? And again, the answer was nothing. Now let's break this down. In verse 6, Elihu essentially said to Job, if you have sinned, what can you do to God? The answer was nothing. Now think of it this way. Think about your neighbor. If you go out and you throw a rock at your neighbor's window, or maybe you do something to his grass or shrubbery or something, you can actually do some physical damage to your neighbor's property. Likewise, and hopefully we don't do that, likewise, a human can go out and do physical damage to the neighbor himself, injure him in some way. Injure his arms, his legs, his head, something. Whereas with God, it's not possible for us to go out and damage God's property up in heaven. It's not possible for us to go out and injure God's leg or his arm. Okay? That was Elihu's point here. The flip side is, again, using our neighbor as an example, we can go out and we can do things for our neighbor that helps them and encourages them. If our neighbor is suffering financially, we're able to give them things that help them through that time. If the neighbor has something that's broken, we're able to physically go and either repair it or help them repair it. Whereas with God, we can't hand God food. We can't go to heaven and repair God's palace up in heaven. Okay? That is Elihu's point here. And he continues this thought in verse 8. Elihu said to Job, your wickedness is for a man like yourself, and your righteousness is for a son of man. Now, your wickedness is for a man like yourself. Again, think of the neighbor. If a human being is wicked and they go out and try to hurt other people, they're going to hurt a man like himself. They're not going to hurt God. They're going to hurt a man like themselves. And likewise, if a person is righteous and goes out and wants to help someone, they're going to be able to help a son of man, another human. Either give them something or encourage them, or help them fix something that's broken. Now Elihu continued, because of the multitude of oppressions, men cry out. They cry for help because of the arm of the mighty. But, notice the word but. So in the previous verse, Elihu pointed out that men who are oppressed are crying out, but none of those men who are oppressed says, quote, and notice the quote goes down to here, where is God my maker, who gives songs in the night, who teaches us men more than the beasts of the earth, and makes us men wiser than the birds of the heavens? So Elihu said that you have all these men who are oppressed and suffering, but they don't ask a basic question, where is God? And Elihu reminded us that God teaches men more than the beasts of the earth. We as humans have more knowledge than beasts. We as humans are wiser than the birds of the heaven. And it's God who made us that way. And so Elihu pointed out that these men who are oppressed don't look for God, don't seek for God when they're oppressed. And the implication is Job was not seeking God when he was oppressed, when he was suffering. Elihu continued in verse 12. There men cry out, but God does not answer because of the pride of evil men. Notice the word because. The reason God doesn't answer men is because men have pride. The implication would have been Job had too much pride. Verse 13. Surely God will not listen to an empty cry, nor will the Almighty regard it. How much less when you, and here Elihu is speaking specifically to Job, how much less when you say you do not behold God, the case is before him and you must wait for him. This last line is a reference. Earlier in the book of Job, when Job was having this dialogue with his friends, Job complained that he was not able to go to God and speak to God directly and state his case and prove to God that he was innocent. And Elihu is referring to that here. And Elihu essentially said, God is not going to listen to an empty cry, and he's certainly not going to listen to Job when Job whines about the fact that God does not respond to him. That's essentially what Elihu was saying here. Verse 15, and this is Elihu speaking to Job. And now, because God has not visited in his anger, nor has he acknowledged transgression well, so Job opens his mouth emptily, he multiplies words without knowledge. Notice the word so. Because of this, therefore this. Because God does not respond to Job, then Job keeps talking, he multiplies his words, and Elihu used the word emptily. In other words, he believed that Job was just speaking a bunch of nonsense and that he was speaking from ignorance. Now, that's the end of this passage. Let's go back to verse 6 and 7. Again, these are rhetorical questions that Elihu asked Job. Job, if you have sinned, what do you accomplish against God? The answer was nothing. If your transgressions are many, what do you do to God? The answer was nothing. If you are righteous, what do you give to God? The answer was nothing. What does God receive from your hand when you are righteous? And again, the answer was nothing. Now, that was Elihu's belief. The question is, was he correct? Now, keep in mind, Elihu was not inspired, and so we cannot use this to formulate our beliefs. In other words, inspiration and inerrancy means the author of Job was inspired and was inerrant when he recorded what happened. In this case, the author of Job accurately recorded what Elihu said. But in this text, the author of Job does not tell us whether or not Elihu was correct, and so we have to go to other passages to make that determination. So let's look at Psalm 50, and this is God speaking to the Israelites. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world is mine and all it contains. Shall I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of male goats? And obviously the answer here was no. Now, at Mount Sinai, God had given the Israelites some commands and regulations about building a tabernacle and offering sacrifices. And sacrifices, animal sacrifices, grain sacrifices, and drink offerings were things that the Israelites were supposed to bring to God. However, here, God was reminding the Israelites that he really isn't going to eat these sacrifices. He's not going to drink any of these offerings because he doesn't eat or drink. And, God reminds the Israelites that he's not going to tell them if he's hungry. And the reason is he created the world. All it contains already belongs to him. So God really didn't need all these sacrifices that the Israelites were bringing. That doesn't mean that they weren't supposed to bring them, but ultimately God really didn't need them. Likewise, in Isaiah 66, this is God speaking to the Israelites. Thus says the Lord, heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. Where then is a house you could build for me? And the answer is, there is no house that the Israelites could build for him. Where is a place that I may rest? And the answer is, there isn't any. Verse 2. This is God speaking to the Israelites. For my hand made all these things, thus all these things came into being, declares the Lord. But, and notice the word but, God's creating a contrast. God doesn't need anything from the Israelites, but this is what he wants. To this one I will look, to him who is humble and contrite of spirit, and who trembles at my word. And so, yes, God told the Israelites to bring sacrifices and offerings, but ultimately what was more important to God was being humble, contrite, and trembling at his word. Now, Paul repeated this concept in Acts 17. This was Paul speaking. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. And so again, we see Paul repeats this idea that God does not dwell in temples. God is not served by humans. God doesn't need food or drink or anything like that. Now, let's talk about how this impacts us. So we've seen that in this dialogue between Elihu and Job, Job had this idea that he was wondering, how it would benefit God when he suffers. And Elihu's response simply was to tell Job that humans are so insignificant compared to God, we can't do anything that either helps him or hurts him. So in other words, Job's question was irrelevant. And we saw in Psalms, in Isaiah, and now Acts that Elihu was correct, that we as humans can't do anything to help God or hurt God. God doesn't need food. He doesn't need a place to live. And so the question is, how does this impact us living in the 21st century? Over the last several decades, there's been two issues that have been debated, and one of them is, what is the role of divorced people within the church? And the other one is, what is the role of women in church or society or the family? Now, the Bible has things to say about both of these issues. One of the traps that we fall into in American Christianity is we ignore some of the restrictions on divorced people and women based on the idea that either this divorced person or this woman has these gifts and talents and abilities that have to be used for God. And sometimes we end up saying things like, well, God needs them to use these gifts and abilities. There's the Great Commission. There's all these lost people, and they have to use these gifts and abilities. But what we've seen here is ultimately God really doesn't need us. We are insignificant to God. God can accomplish the Great Commission without us. He merely gives us the opportunity to participate in it. Now, there's a couple more verses that really apply to this. Let's look at 1 Samuel 15:22. Samuel said, and Samuel is talking to Saul, "Has the Lord as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and insubordination is as iniquity and idolatry." So let's back up here. Samuel essentially said, yes, God told the Israelites to make the sacrifices, but even more important than the offerings and sacrifices is obedience. And he went so far as to say, rebellion against God is as bad as divination. Insubordination against God is as bad as idolatry. Now, this is also repeated in Hosea 6, verse 6. And this is God speaking to the Israelites. "For I delight in loyalty rather than sacrifice, and I delight in the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." So again, from God's perspective, obedience, loyalty, knowledge of God is more important than sacrifices and burnt offerings. And then we see in John 14:21, this is Jesus speaking to his disciples, and he has said, "He who has my commandments and keeps them, he is the one who loves me." And so as we think about our lives here in the 21st century, as I said, we tend to get into this mindset of thinking, so-and-so has these gifts and abilities and they have to use them to serve God, even if that means disobeying some of other God's commandments. But that's the wrong way to look at it, because first and foremost, God wants obedience. And so what has to come first is obedience. And so for divorced people and for women, as painful as it might be to have gifts and abilities that they can't use, if they're in a situation where the Bible has restricted them from using those gifts and abilities, then what God really wants is for them to submit to Him and submit to those restrictions rather than the use of those gifts or abilities. If you'd like to receive the next episode of Bible Mountain via email, please visit www.biblemountain.com, click on follow, and there will be a place to enter your email address and subscribe to my email feed. This is a free subscription and your email will not be sold nor given away. Also, if you like this video, please use the share buttons on your webpage to like it and or share it with your friends. And once again, thank you for watching BibleMountain.com.